Close your eyes and imagine walking into a gallery where every single artwork you see has been forbidden, censored, or completely erased from history books. Picture masterpieces that were hidden in basements, burned in protests, or dismissed by critics simply because of who created them. Tonight, you're about to discover the most revolutionary chapter in art history, one that changed not just what art could be, but who was allowed to create it. In the next 2 hours, you'll witness a forgotten female artist whose work was so powerful that galleries refused to show it for decades, only to discover it's now worth millions. You'll learn about a secret network of black artists who created an entire movement in Harlem, apartments, while the rest of America ignored their genius. And you'll uncover how 3 simple words spray-painted on a wall in 1969 sparked an artistic revolution that's still reshaping museums today. But here's what will truly amaze you. Every single one of these artists faced a choice that would determine not just their career, but their survival. Stay invisible and safe, or risk everything to tell their truth through art. The decisions they made didn't just change their lives, they changed the entire world of art forever. Welcome back to Art History, Piece by Piece. I'm your guide through this midnight journey, where forgotten stories come alive and hidden truths emerge from the shadows. Tonight we enter the age of identity, where art became a weapon, a shield, and a revolution, all at once. Close your eyes and transport yourself to New York City, 1961. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the promise of change. In a small apartment on the Lower East Side, a young woman sits before a canvas, her hands trembling not from nervousness, but from pure, electric excitement. Her name is unknown to you now, but by the end of our journey tonight, you'll understand why her story was buried for 50 years. This woman is painting something that has never been seen before in the art world. Herself, naked, powerful, unashamed. But this isn't just any self-portrait. She's painting her body as a landscape, her curves as mountains, her skin as terrain to be explored rather than objectified. She doesn't know it yet, but she's about to start a revolution. The year 1961 represents a moment in art history that feels like the deep breath before a thunderclap. Abstract expressionism still dominated gallery walls. Jackson Pollock had died just 5 years earlier, leaving behind a world where art was masculine, aggressive, and completely controlled by men who looked remarkably similar to each other. Gallery owners, critics, collectors, all cut from the same cloth, all speaking the same language of power and exclusion. But beneath this polished surface, something extraordinary was stirring. Women artists were working in isolation, creating masterpieces in kitchen studios, while their male counterparts enjoyed fame and fortune. Black artists were developing revolutionary techniques in communities that the art world pretended didn't exist. Queer artists were encoding their identities into symbols and metaphors, creating a secret language of survival and celebration. They had no idea they were about to collide in the most beautiful, chaotic, and transformative explosion in art history. Let me tell you about Alice Neal, because her story illuminates everything that was about to change. Born in 1900, Neal spent decades painting portraits that captured the souls of her subjects with such brutal honesty that viewers often felt uncomfortable looking at them. She painted pregnant women, elderly neighbors, civil rights activists, people the art world considered unworthy subjects. For 40 years, Alice Neal was essentially invisible to the mainstream art world. She lived in Spanish Harlem, raising children alone, painting anyone who would sit for her. Gallery owners would visit her studio, praise her work privately, then disappear without offering exhibitions. She was too raw, too honest, too female for their refined tastes. But Alice kept painting because she understood something that the art establishment refused to acknowledge: that art's greatest power lies not in abstraction or intellectual theory, but in the courage to show human beings exactly as they are: vulnerable, complex, beautiful, and real. By 1961, Alice was 61 years old and still largely unknown. She had no way of knowing that in just a few short years, the entire art world would shift beneath her feet, creating space for voices like hers to finally be heard. She couldn't see that a movement was building, quietly, persistently, inevitably, that would change everything. But first, that movement needed a spark, and that spark was about to come from the most unexpected place imaginable. Picture this scene. It's 1963, and Betty Friedan has just published The Feminine Mystique, sending shockwaves through American society. Women across the country are beginning to question everything they've been told about their roles, their limitations, their possibilities. And in art studios from coast to coast, female artists are holding paintbrushes like weapons, ready to wage war on centuries of exclusion. But the revolution didn't start with manifestos or marches. It started with a single, radical act: women deciding to paint their own experiences, instead of conforming to male expectations of what art should be. Judy Chicago was 24 years old when she made a decision that would echo through art history forever. Standing in her California studio, surrounded by the geometric abstractions that were popular at the time, she suddenly realized she was creating art that had nothing to do with her actual life as a woman. She was following rules written by men, using a visual language that didn't speak to her deepest truths. So she made a choice that seemed simple, but was actually revolutionary. She would start painting from her own experience as a woman, using imagery that emerged from her own body and psyche. The results were explosive, literally. Her early paintings featured explosive forms, volcanic imagery, and organic shapes that seemed to pulse with feminine energy. The art world's reaction was swift and brutal. Critics dismissed her work as too biological, overly emotional, or simply not serious art. Gallery owners suggested she return to making real paintings, meaning paintings that looked like they could have been created by men. But Judy Chicago wasn't alone anymore. Across the country, women artists were having similar revelations. Miriam Shapiro in New York was beginning to incorporate fabric and traditionally feminine materials into her paintings, creating what she would later call femage, art that celebrated rather than apologized for feminine aesthetics. Faith Ringgold was pushing even further boundaries, creating soft sculptures and story quilts that combined fine art with traditional women's crafts. When galleries refused to show her work, she started hanging it in alternative spaces, proving that art didn't need institutional approval to have power. Meanwhile, in the most exclusive corners of the art world, something unprecedented was happening. Women who had been working in isolation were beginning to find each other, forming networks of support and collaboration that had never existed before. Let me share with you one of the most remarkable moments in this awakening. In 1970, a group of women artists in New York learned that the Whitney Museum's upcoming exhibition would feature 143 male artists and only 8 women. Instead of accepting this as normal, they organized a protest that shook the art establishment to its core. the women artists in revolution, led by Faith Ringgold, marched on the Whitney with signs demanding 50% women artists and disrupted the museum's comfortable complacency. For the first time, someone was asking the question that should have been obvious. Why was half the population represented by less than 6% of exhibited artists? But the most powerful moment came not during the protest itself, but in its aftermath. Curator John I.H. Bauer defended the museum's selections by explaining that they had chosen the most important artists available. Faith Ringgold's response became legendary. Important to whom? That simple question, important to whom, became the battle cry of an entire generation of artists who refused to let others define their worth, their importance, their right to exist in the art world. The personal had officially become political, and there was no going back. Imagine walking through the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1975 and trying to find a single painting created by a woman. You would wander through room after room of masterpieces, all created by men, all telling stories from masculine perspectives, all defining what art could be and who was allowed to create it. Now imagine a young art student named Jenny Holzer walking through those same galleries and making a radical decision. If the art world wouldn't make space for women's voices, she would create her own space in her own way, using her own rules. Jenny Holzer began by printing anonymous statements on posters and wheat-pasting them around New York City. Simple phrases like, "Abuse of power comes as no surprise," and "The unrelenting idealism of the young is the terror of the old." She turned the entire city into her gallery, bypassing traditional gatekeepers completely. But Holzer's guerrilla tactics were just one part of a larger transformation happening in the art world. Women weren't just demanding access to existing institutions. They were reimagining what art could be entirely. The Guerrilla Girls emerged in 1985 as perhaps the most brilliant artistic activists of the era. Wearing gorilla masks and adopting the names of dead women artists, they created posters, billboards, and performances that used humor and hard data to expose the art world's systematic exclusion of women and artists of color. Their most famous poster featured the Mona Lisa, wearing a gorilla mask with the text, "Do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum?" Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. The poster was so effective that it appeared on buses throughout New York City, forcing thousands of daily commuters to confront uncomfortable truths about the art they consumed and celebrated. But perhaps the most ambitious project of this era was Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, a massive installation that took 5 years to complete and involved over 400 volunteers. The piece featured a triangular table with 39 place settings, each honoring a woman from history who had been forgotten or marginalized. Each place setting was unique, featuring a hand-painted porcelain plate with imagery celebrating that woman's contributions, alongside an embroidered runner with her name and symbols representing her achievements. The craftsmanship was exquisite, combining traditional women's arts, like ceramics and needlework, with monumental scale and concept. When The Dinner Party opened in 1979, the response was explosive. Over 100,000 people waited in lines around the block to see it. Women wept while viewing the installation, many seeing their own histories reflected in art for the first time. Men struggled to understand why something celebrating women's achievements felt so threatening to traditional power structures. Critics were divided. but their language revealed everything about the biases being challenged. Some dismissed it as craft rather than art. Others called it too decorative or overly feminist. But the public response made it clear that something profound was happening. Art was becoming a space where women could reclaim their own narratives. Carolee Schneemann took this reclamation even further with performances that used her own body as both subject and medium. Her 1975 performance, Interior Scroll, involved pulling a paper scroll from her vagina while reading from it, challenging every assumption about women's bodies, sexuality, and creativity. The performance was shocking, confrontational, and absolutely necessary. For centuries, women's bodies had been objectified in art, painted and sculpted by men for the male gaze. Schneemann was declaring ownership of her own body and using it to tell her own story on her own terms. Barbara Kruger developed another revolutionary approach, creating text-based artworks that looked like advertisements, but contained subversive messages about power, consumerism, and identity. Her iconic red, white, and black compositions featured phrases like, "Your body is a battleground," and "I shop, therefore I am." Kruger understood that in a media-saturated world, art needed to speak the language of mass communication to be heard. She placed her work on billboards, in subway stations, on shopping bags, anywhere the public might encounter her messages unexpectedly. These women weren't just creating art, they were creating entirely new ways of being artists. They were proving that art could be political without sacrificing aesthetic power, that personal experience was worthy of artistic exploration, and that the art world's definitions of importance and excellence needed fundamental revision. The narrative was being reclaimed, one artwork at a time. Now transport yourself to Harlem in 1960, where the air itself seems to vibrate with creative energy. In basement studios and converted warehouses, Black artists are creating works so revolutionary that the mainstream art world doesn't even have language to describe them yet. This isn't the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, though its spirit lives on in every brushstroke. This is something new, a movement of artists who refuse to choose between their racial identity and their artistic vision, who understand that their blackness is not separate from their artistry but essential to it. Romar Bearden sits in his studio, surrounded by magazines, newspapers, and fragments of the photographs. He's developing a technique that will change art history forever. Collage compositions that piece together the African American experience from scattered fragments, creating powerful new narratives from the debris of popular culture. Bearden's The Block series shows Harlem life not as outsiders imagine it, but as someone who lives there sees it. Children playing, elders watching from windows, music spilling from doorways, all rendered in his distinctive collage style that makes the everyday feel mythic and profound. But Bearden knows something that the art establishment is only beginning to understand. Black artists have been creating profound works for generations, developing techniques and perspectives that could revolutionize contemporary art if anyone bothered to pay attention. Jacob Lawrence had already proven this with his Migration series in 1941, 60 panels telling the story of the Great Migration in bold narrative paintings that combined historical documentation with modernist aesthetics. The series was so powerful that it became the first work by a black artist acquired by the Museum of Modern Art. Yet by the 1960s, Lawrence was still one of the few black artists with mainstream recognition. The art world's institutional racism meant that countless talented artists remained invisible, their innovations unrecognized, their contributions erased from art history textbooks. This was about to change, and the catalyst would be as unexpected as it was inevitable. Elizabeth Catlett was living in Mexico, creating sculptures and prints that celebrated Black womanhood with a dignity and power that seemed revolutionary simply because it was so rare. Her Black Woman series showed African American women as mothers, workers, and warriors, complex human beings rather than stereotypes or objects of pity. When Catlett's work began circulating in the United States during the Civil Rights era, it created shockwaves. Here was an artist who was simultaneously Black, female, and uncompromisingly political, someone the art world had no category for and no idea how to handle. Meanwhile, in Chicago, a collective called AfriCobra was forming around principles that would reshape contemporary art. The group, founded by Jeff Donaldson, developed an aesthetic philosophy based on African artistic traditions, civil rights activism, and revolutionary politics. AfriCobra artists used bright, vibrant colors that they called Kool-Aid colors. The artificial brightness of popular culture transformed into something beautiful and defiant. They incorporated text, symbols, and imagery from both African traditions and contemporary Black life, creating artworks that functioned as both aesthetic objects and political statements. Wadsworth Gerald's Revolutionary from 1972 shows a Black Panther member surrounded by African patterns and revolutionary slogans. The painting pulses with energy and anger, but also with joy and pride, emotions that mainstream art rarely associated with Black political consciousness. The breakthrough moment came in 1976 with an exhibition that should have happened decades earlier. 2 centuries of Black American art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art was the first major museum survey of African American artists, featuring over 200 works spanning 2 centuries. The exhibition's impact was immediate and profound. Visitors, many encountering Black artists for the first time, discovered a rich tradition of innovation and excellence that had been systematically excluded from art history. Critics who attended expecting novelty found sophistication. Audiences expecting propaganda found beauty, but the exhibition also revealed uncomfortable truths about the art world's institutional racism. How had such talented artists remained invisible for so long? Why were their innovations not part of standard art history curricula? Whose interests were served by their exclusion? Faith Ringgold, who we met earlier in our journey, was asking similar questions through her story quilts, narrative artworks that combined painting with traditional quilting techniques. Her Tar Beach series tells the story of a young Black girl who dreams of flying above the city, escaping the limitations imposed by racism and poverty. The quilts were radical on multiple levels. They challenged the distinction between fine art and craft. They centered Black family life as worthy subject matter, and they used a medium associated with women's domestic work to tell stories of freedom and aspiration. Betiesar was working with the found objects and assemblage techniques to create artworks that confronted racist imagery head-on. Her The Liberation of Aunt Jemima transformed the mammy stereotype into a figure of resistance and power, holding both a broom and a rifle, reclaiming and redefining a degrading caricature. Jean-Michel Basquiat emerged in the late 1970s, creating paintings that combined street art aesthetics with fine art sophistication. His work celebrated Black heroes like jazz musicians and athletes, while critiquing racism and colonialism through layered imagery and text. Basquiat's meteoric rise from homeless street artist to internationally acclaimed painter in just a few years, proved that the art world was finally ready to embrace Black artistic voices. But it also raised difficult questions about whether individual success could address systemic problems. Kerry James Marshall began developing what he called a Black aesthetic in the 1980s, creating paintings that deliberately inserted Black figures into art historical contexts where they had been absent. His Garden Project series shows Black families in idealized suburban settings, challenging assumptions about who belongs in spaces of beauty and prosperity. These artists weren't just creating beautiful objects, they were rewriting the visual language of American art. They were proving that Black experience was not marginal to American culture, but central to it. That African American artists weren't seeking inclusion in existing traditions, but were creating new traditions entirely. The colors of freedom were spreading across canvases nationwide, impossible to ignore any longer. Picture a world where love itself is illegal, where your deepest emotions must be hidden, coded, disguised. This was the reality for queer artists throughout most of art history. Creators who had to embed their truths in symbols, metaphors, and secret languages that only other queer people could fully understand. But by the 1960s, something was shifting. The Stonewall riots of 1969 marked a turning point, not just in LGBTQ+ rights, but in queer artistic expression. For the first time, artists could begin to imagine creating work that didn't require elaborate disguises or coded messages. Jasper Johns had spent the 1950s creating paintings of flags, targets, and numbers, images so familiar they seemed neutral, but which contained layers of meaning about identity, desire, and belonging. Johns and his partner Robert Rauschenberg were revolutionizing American art while maintaining careful silence about their relationship. Their collaborative works from this period, created under the joint pseudonym Matson Jones, represent some of the most innovative art of the era. But the mainstream art world celebrated their aesthetic innovations while remaining willfully blind to the personal relationship that made their collaboration possible. This was the paradox of queer art in the pre-liberation era. Artists could achieve recognition for their work while remaining invisible as people. Their sexuality was simultaneously central to their creativity and absolutely forbidden from acknowledgement. David Hockney began changing this dynamic with paintings that celebrated gay life with unprecedented openness. His Pool paintings from the 1960s showed beautiful men in idealized California settings, creating imagery of gay desire that was both explicit and aesthetically sophisticated. When Hockney's work became internationally successful, it marked a breakthrough moment. Here was an openly gay artist whose sexuality wasn't separate from his art, but integral to it, whose paintings of male beauty and domestic life offered alternatives to heteronormative assumptions about love and desire. But the real revolution in queer art came with the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s. Faced with a pandemic that was killing their friends, lovers, and communities, while mainstream society remained indifferent or hostile, queer artists transformed grief into activism and silence into powerful artistic statements. Felix Gonzalez Torres created some of the most moving artworks of the era, using minimal materials and maximal emotion. His untitled Perfect Lovers consists of two identical clocks hanging side by side, their second hands moving in perfect synchronization until mechanical differences gradually cause them to fall out of sync. The piece functions as both abstract conceptual art and profound meditation on love, loss, and mortality. It can be appreciated by anyone, but for those who knew that Gonzalez Torres' partner Ross was dying of AIDS, the work becomes unbearably poignant, a metaphor for two lives moving together until death forces them apart. Keith Haring was using public art to spread messages of love and activism throughout New York City. His subway drawings and outdoor murals featured dancing figures, radiant babies, and symbols of joy that countered the despair and prejudice of the AIDS era with celebratory images of life and community. Haring's work demonstrated how queer art could be both deeply personal and broadly accessible, how messages of love and acceptance could reach audiences who might never set foot in a gallery. Grand Fury, the art collective associated with ACT UP, created some of the most effective political art of the 20th century. Their Silence, Bow, Death campaign transformed a Nazi symbol into a call for action. Their Kissing Doesn't Kill advertisements featured interracial and same-sex couples, and their installations in museums forced mainstream institutions to confront their complicity in AIDS-related stigma. Catherine Opie began photographing queer communities in ways that challenged both mainstream stereotypes and idealized representations. Her portraits of leather daddies, drag performers, and LGBTQ+ families showed the diversity and complexity of queer life, while maintaining the dignity and humanity of her subjects. Nan Goldin's The Ballad of Sexual Dependency documented her own life and relationships with brutal honesty, creating a visual diary that included domestic violence, drug addiction, transgender friends, and gay relationships. Her work proved that personal photography could function as fine art while documenting communities that mainstream media ignored or sensationalized. But perhaps the most profound shift in queer art came not from individual artists, but from the emergence of queer theory as an intellectual framework. Artists like Jack Pearson began creating installations that questioned the stability of identity itself, suggesting that sexuality, like art, might be fluid, performative, and resistant to fixed categories. Glenn Ligon's text-based paintings incorporated quotes from writers like James Baldwin and Zora Neale Hurston, exploring the intersections between racial and sexual identity through conceptual art strategies. His work demonstrated how queer artists of color faced double marginalization while creating some of the most innovative art of their generation. By the 1990s, queer art had evolved from hidden messages to explicit celebration, from survival strategy to revolutionary aesthetics. Artists were no longer asking permission to exist. They were demanding recognition for the contributions they had been making all along. The Whitney Biennial of 1993 featured more openly LGBTQ+ artists than ever before, marking official recognition of queer art as a major force in contemporary culture. But this institutional acceptance came with its own questions. Would mainstream recognition dilute the radical potential of queer art? Could queer artists maintain their edge while gaining mainstream success? Love was no longer silent, but the questions it raised were becoming more complex than ever. Imagine standing at a crossroads where every path represents a different aspect of your identity. Your race, your gender, your sexuality, your class background, your cultural heritage. For most of art history, artists were expected to choose one path, to simplify their identity into something the art world could easily categorize and market. But by the 1980s, a new generation of artists was refusing to make that choice. They understood that identity isn't singular, but intersectional, that their experiences as women of color, queer people of color, or working class artists couldn't be separated into neat compartments. Audre Lorde, the great poet and activist, had given them the theoretical framework. There is no such thing as a single-issue struggle, because we do not live single-issue lives. This became the guiding principle for artists who were tired of being asked to choose between their identities. Adrian Piper was one of the first visual artists to explicitly address this complexity. Light-skinned enough to pass as white, Piper created performances and conceptual works that forced audiences to confront their assumptions about race, identity, and authenticity. Her calling cards were small printed texts she would hand to people who made racist comments in her presence, not realizing she was black. The cards explained her racial identity and asked the recipient to consider their assumptions. This simple gesture transformed everyday racism into material for conceptual art, while asserting Piper's right to define herself. But Piper's most powerful work dealt with the psychological complexity of living between racial categories. Her video installation, Cornered, features the artist speaking directly to viewers about racial identity while sitting in front of an American flag. She forces viewers to examine their own racial assumptions while revealing the impossibility of stable racial categories. Lorna Simpson was using photography to explore similar themes around black womanhood. Her large-scale photographs typically showed black women from behind, or with faces obscured, accompanied by text that raised questions about visibility, objectification, and stereotyping. Simpson's Guarded Conditions shows the same woman in different poses, each labeled with words like cautious, meticulous, and mindful. The work suggests both the hypervigilance required to navigate racist society and the inadequacy of language to capture complex human experience. Carrie Mae Weems pushed these investigations even further with her kitchen table series, photographs that used her own kitchen as a stage for exploring black family life, relationships, and female autonomy. The circular spotlight that illuminates each scene creates intimacy while suggesting performance, making viewers aware of both the privacy and the constructed nature of domestic space. Ana Mendieta was working with similar themes around cultural displacement and female identity. Born in Cuba and sent to the United States as a child, Mendieta created earthworks and performance pieces that explored themes of exile, belonging, and spiritual connection to landscape. Her Silhouetta series involved creating body-shaped impressions in natural settings using flowers, earth, fire, and water. The works existed only temporarily, documented through photography, suggesting both presence and absence, permanence and impermanence. Mendieta's work was deeply personal, but spoke to broader themes about immigration, cultural loss, and the search for home. Her tragic death in 1985, she fell from her apartment window, in circumstances that remain disputed, highlighted the precarious position of artists working at the intersections of multiple marginalized identities. The Guerrilla Girls, whom we encountered earlier, began expanding their focus beyond gender to address racial exclusion as well. Their research revealed that the art world's diversity problem extended beyond gender. Artists of color were even more dramatically underrepresented than women overall. Their poster, The Advantages of Being a Woman Artist, used bitter irony to highlight the obstacles facing women in the art world, working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, and knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, but their work on intersectionality went deeper than statistics. They began analyzing how racism and sexism combined to create particular obstacles for women of color, how class background affected access to art education and gallery representation, and how age discrimination compounded other forms of bias. Pepon Osorio was creating installations that addressed the complex identity negotiations of Latino artists in the United States. His elaborate room-sized installations incorporated religious imagery, popular culture references, and personal narratives to explore themes of cultural hybridity and community resistance. His work, Badge of Honor, recreated a prison cell and a family living room, connected by video monitors that allowed family members to communicate with an incarcerated relative. The installation addressed how mass incarceration affects Latino families, while questioning boundaries between public and private space. Renee Green was using multimedia installations to explore African diaspora connections and the complexity of contemporary Black identity. Her gallery installations often included sound, video, text, and objects that required viewers to move through space and encounter different perspectives and time periods. Green's work suggested that identity itself might be best understood as an installation, something constructed from multiple elements, experienced differently from various positions, never quite stable or complete. By the 1990s, these artists had fundamentally changed how the art world understood identity. They proved that complexity wasn't a weakness, but a strength. That the most innovative art often came from artists who refused to simplify their experiences for mainstream consumption. But this success raised new challenges. As museums began collecting work by artists of color, as galleries sought out diverse voices, questions arose about tokenism, market forces, and the relationship between political art and commercial success. The intersection had become visible, but navigating it remained as complex as ever. By the 1990s, something remarkable was happening in galleries and museums around the world. Art that had been dismissed as too personal, too political, or too specific was being recognized as some of the most powerful and universally resonant work of the late 20th century. This recognition didn't come easily. It represented the culmination of decades of struggle by artists who insisted that their personal experiences, as women, as people of color, as LGBTQ+ individuals, were not narrow or specialized, but spoke to fundamental human truths that mainstream art had been ignoring. Cindy Sherman was creating photography that seemed deeply personal, but revealed universal truths about femininity, performance, and identity. Her untitled film stills featured Sherman herself in various poses and costumes, recreating the visual language of Hollywood movies from the 1950s and 60s. But Sherman's photographs weren't nostalgic celebrations of cinema. They were careful dissections of how women learn to perform femininity, how identity becomes a series of roles we learn to play, rather than something authentic and stable. Each photograph showed Sherman as a different character, the innocent ingenue, the sophisticated city woman, the vulnerable housewife. But viewers gradually realized they weren't seeing different women. They were seeing the same person, demonstrating how thoroughly femininity is constructed rather than natural. Sherman's work became internationally celebrated precisely because it used personal experience to reveal broader truths about gender performance and media representation. Her individual investigation into feminine identity opened questions that resonated with viewers regardless of their own gender identity. Meanwhile, Cora Walker was creating silhouette installations that addressed the legacy of slavery through imagery that was simultaneously historical and deeply personal. Walker's room-sized installations featured black paper figures engaged in scenes that combined antebellum iconography with contemporary references. Walker's work was controversial within black communities because she used racist imagery and stereotypes in ways that some viewers found painful or counterproductive. But her installations forced conversations about how slavery's legacy continues to shape contemporary race relations, how historical trauma manifests in present-day interactions. By using her own psychological relationship to this history as raw material, Walker created art that made abstract historical concepts viscerally immediate. Her personal excavation of inherited trauma became a lens through which viewers could examine their own relationships to American racial history. Shirin Neshat began creating photography and video installations that explored her experience as an Iranian woman living in exile after the Islamic Revolution. Her black and white photographs often featured herself with Persian calligraphy written on her skin. Exploring themes of cultural displacement, religious identity, and political resistance, Neshat's work spoke specifically to the Iranian diaspora experience, while addressing broader questions about exile, identity, and the relationship between personal and political freedom. Her artistic exploration of her own cultural displacement resonated with immigrants from many backgrounds, while educating broader audiences about Iranian history and culture. The Venice Biennale of 1995 marked a turning point in international recognition of identity-based art. For the first time, the prestigious exhibition featured significant representation from women artists and artists of color, acknowledging that contemporary art could no longer be understood without these voices. But this mainstream success also created new tensions. As identity-based art gained commercial and critical success, questions arose about authenticity, exploitation, and the art market's ability to absorb and neutralize politically challenging work. Some critics argued that the art world's embrace of identity politics was superficial, that galleries and museums were collecting diverse artists without addressing underlying structural problems. Others worried that political art was being aestheticized in ways that drained it of activist potential. Artists themselves were grappling with these contradictions. Success brought opportunities but also pressures to represent entire communities, to educate audiences about complex social issues, to maintain political edge while appealing to mainstream tastes. Kerry James Marshall addressed these tensions directly in paintings that simultaneously celebrated Black life and critiqued the art world's relationship to Black artists. His large-scale paintings featured Black figures painted in deliberate reference to art historical traditions while addressing contemporary issues like gentrification and cultural appropriation. Marshall's work insisted on the right of Black artists to engage with the entire history of painting while centering Black experience as worthy of monumental treatment. His paintings were simultaneously deeply rooted in African American life and engaged with universal themes of beauty, community, and human dignity. Glenn Ligon was using text-based paintings to explore how language shapes identity and experience. His paintings incorporated quotes from writers like James Baldwin and Richard Pryor, but rendered in ways that made the text increasingly difficult to read As it moved down the canvas, Ligon's work suggested that identity itself might be like his paintings, clear and legible at first, but becoming more complex and ambiguous the more closely you examine it. His investigation of his own experience as a black gay man opened questions about the stability of all identity categories. By the late 1990s, these artists had fundamentally shifted the conversation around art and identity. They had proven that personal experience wasn't the opposite of universal relevance, but often the path to it. They had demonstrated that political art could be aesthetically sophisticated, that diversity wasn't separate from quality, but essential to it. Most importantly, they had created space for future generations of artists to explore their own identities without apologizing for their specificity or limiting their ambitions. The personal had revealed itself as the most direct route to the universal, and art history would never be the same. As we reach the end of our journey through the age of identity, take a moment to consider how profoundly the art world has been transformed. The galleries that once showcased only white male artists now feature voices from every community. The museums that once ignored entire populations now compete to acquire work by previously marginalized artists. The art history textbooks that once erased countless contributions now struggle to include the full breadth of human creativity. But this transformation didn't happen accidentally, and it wasn't granted as a gift by generous institutions. Every change we've witnessed tonight was fought for, demanded, and won through the courage of individual artists who refused to accept exclusion as natural or inevitable. Consider the ripple effects of what began with Alice Neal painting in her Spanish Harlem studio. Her insistence on painting human truth rather than abstract theory helped create space for countless artists to explore their own realities. Her refusal to disappear despite decades of neglect proved that persistence could outlast prejudice. The women who disrupted the Whitney Museum in 1970 didn't just change one exhibition, they changed how institutions think about representation. Their simple question, important to whom, continues to echo through every curatorial decision, every acquisition meeting, every grant application review. The Guerrilla Girls' anonymous activism proved that humor could be more effective than anger, that data could be more powerful than rhetoric, that sisterhood could challenge systems that seemed impossible to change. Their gorilla masks became symbols of resistance that inspired activists far beyond the art world. Faith Ringgold's story quilts demonstrated that the boundaries between fine art and craft were artificial constructs designed to exclude women's traditional practices. Her integration of narrative, textile work, and painting opened doors for countless artists working in mixed media and non-traditional materials. Jenny Holzer's transition from anonymous street posters to LED installations in major museums shows how radical ideas can infiltrate mainstream institutions when they're persistent enough and powerful enough to ignore. Her electronic messages now scroll across the facades of buildings worldwide, proving that public art can change how people think about power, truth, and responsibility. The AIDS crisis, despite its devastating toll, produced some of the most moving and effective political art in history. Artists like Felix Gonzalez Torres and Keith Haring transformed grief into beauty, anger into activism, silence into powerful statements that continue to resonate with new generations facing different but related challenges. David Hockney's celebration of gay life in paint helped normalize LGBTQ+ relationships in ways that legal arguments alone couldn't achieve. His beautiful paintings of love and domesticity created visual alternatives to heteronormative assumptions, proving that representation matters not just for visibility, but for imagination. The emergence of artists working at intersections, Adrian Piper's explorations of racial passing, Anna Mendietta's investigations of cultural displacement, Carrie James Marshall's assertions of Black artistic excellence, expanded how we understand identity itself. They proved that complexity isn't a weakness, but a strength, that the most interesting art often comes from the most complicated positions. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the age of identity is this. It changed not just who could be an artist, but what art could be about. Before this movement, art was expected to transcend the particularities of individual experience, to reach universal truths. These artists proved that the path to universality often runs directly through specificity, that the most personal art can be the most broadly meaningful. Today, when we see exhibitions that celebrate diversity as natural rather than exceptional, when we encounter artists exploring their own identities without apology or explanation, when we witness museums actively seeking out previously marginalized voices, we're seeing the fruits of battles fought by the artists we've encountered tonight. Their victory wasn't complete, and the work continues. Contemporary artists still face obstacles based on their identities. Institutional racism and sexism persist in subtler forms. Market forces continue to shape which voices get heard and which remain marginalized. But the fundamental ground has shifted. No longer can anyone seriously argue that art should be separate from politics, that personal experience is too narrow for artistic exploration, or that quality and diversity are opposing values. The artists of the age of identity proved definitively that excellence comes from inclusion, not exclusion. Young artists today inherit a world where their identities are understood as sources of strength rather than obstacles to overcome. They can build on techniques developed by previous generations while exploring their own unique positions and perspectives. They don't have to choose between political relevance and aesthetic sophistication, between personal truth and universal appeal. The revolution that began with women painting their own experiences, with Black artists asserting their rightful place in art history, with LGBTQ+ artists refusing to hide their love, that revolution is ongoing. Each new generation of artists continues the work of expanding who gets to speak and what stories get told through art. As our journey through the age of identity draws to a close, let's turn our attention to how these revolutionary changes continue to unfold in the 21st century. The artists we've encountered tonight didn't just open doors, they created entirely new architectures of possibility. Today's art world would be unrecognizable to the gallery owners and critics of 1960. Museums actively seek out diverse artists. Auction houses compete for works by previously ignored creators. Art fairs celebrate global perspectives rather than reinforcing Western dominance. But this transformation has also created new challenges and questions. How do contemporary artists navigate the expectations that come with increased visibility? What happens when identity-based art becomes commercially successful? How do new technologies and global connectivity change how artists explore and express their identities? Carrie James Marshall, whom we met earlier in our journey, continues to evolve his practice in ways that address these questions directly. His recent paintings feature Black figures in art historical settings, but with a twist. The figures are painted in such deep black that they seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. Marshall describes this technique as making blackness undeniably present in spaces where it has historically been absent. His figures can't be ignored, can't be mistaken for anything other than black, can't be absorbed into colorblind fantasies about universal humanity. But Marshall's work also demonstrates how identity-based art has matured beyond simple representation. His paintings are simultaneously about blackness and about painting itself, about art history and about contemporary life, about politics and about beauty. They refuse the either-or categories that once forced artists to choose between identity and aesthetics. Kehinde Wiley has taken a different approach to similar themes, creating portraits that place contemporary black subjects in poses and settings borrowed from classical European paintings. His subjects are often young black men from urban neighborhoods, painted with the dignity and grandeur traditionally reserved for aristocrats and religious figures. Wiley's work demonstrates how identity-based art can be both deeply serious and joyfully playful. His paintings celebrate black masculinity while questioning art historical hierarchies, honoring his subjects while commenting on representation and power. The success of Wiley's work, including his official portrait of President Barack Obama, shows how far the art world has traveled since the days when black artists struggled for any recognition at all. But it also raises questions about how political art functions when it achieves mainstream success. Amy Sherald, who painted Michelle Obama's official portrait, represents another evolution in identity-based art. Her paintings feature black subjects with gray skin tones, removing the racial markers that typically determine how viewers interpret black bodies. Sherald's technique forces viewers to encounter her subjects as individuals rather than representatives of racial categories. Her portraits suggest that identity might be more fluid and complex than our social categories allow, that seeing people clearly might require removing some of the lenses through which we're accustomed to looking. These contemporary artists inherited the groundwork laid by the generation we've encountered tonight, but they're facing different challenges and opportunities. They can assume audiences that are more diverse and sophisticated about identity issues, but they also face art markets that can commodify and neutralize political content. The rise of social media has created new platforms for artistic activism, while also creating new pressures for artists to represent themselves and their communities in public. Artists can reach global audiences directly, but they also face constant scrutiny and the expectation to educate as well as create. Contemporary LGBTQ+ artists like Catherine Opie have continued to evolve their practices in response to changing social conditions. Opie's recent work includes photographs of LGBTQ+ families that show same-sex couples and transgender individuals in domestic settings that emphasize normalcy and love rather than difference or struggle. This shift reflects broader changes in LGBTQ+ rights and visibility, but it also shows how identity-based art continues to evolve. Where earlier generations fought for visibility and basic acceptance, contemporary queer artists can explore more complex questions about relationships, family structures, and community. The global art world has also expanded to include voices from previously marginalized regions and cultures. Artists from Africa, Asia, and Latin America are gaining international recognition, not as representatives of non-Western art, but as contributors to contemporary global conversations about identity, politics, and aesthetics. This globalization of the art world represents another legacy of the age of identity, the understanding that interesting art can come from anywhere, that excellence isn't limited by geography or cultural background, that diversity of perspective enriches rather than dilutes artistic quality. But globalization has also created new forms of cultural complexity. Artists working across cultures face questions about appropriation, authenticity, and representation that previous generations didn't have to navigate. The digital revolution has created entirely new mediums for artistic expression, while also changing how identity itself is constructed and performed. Artists working with video, social media, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence are exploring how technology shapes identity formation and community building. As we prepare to conclude our exploration of the age of identity, I want you to understand that what we've witnessed tonight isn't a historical chapter that's closed, but an ongoing revolution that continues to unfold with each new generation of artists. The courage we've seen tonight, Alice Neal painting truth in solitude, Faith Ringgold disrupting museums, Felix Gonzalez Torres transforming grief into beauty, Adrian Piper forcing conversations about race. This courage continues to manifest in contemporary artists who face new challenges while building on established foundations. The questions these artists raised remain relevant and urgent. Who gets to tell their story through art? Whose experiences are considered worthy of aesthetic attention? How do we balance personal truth with universal appeal? What is the relationship between artistic excellence and social justice? But the context for these questions continues to evolve. Today's artists work in a globalized art world where diversity is increasingly expected rather than exceptional. They have access to technologies that previous generations couldn't imagine. They face market forces that can both amplify and commodify their voices. Most importantly, they inherit a world where the possibility of artistic expression is no longer limited by traditional categories of race, gender, sexuality, or cultural background. The battles fought by the artists we've encountered tonight have expanded the very definition of what art can be and who can create it. This expansion represents one of the most significant developments in human creative history. For centuries, artistic expression was limited to a small fraction of humanity. The vast majority of human experiences, perspectives, and insights were systematically excluded from cultural production. The age of identity began the process of correcting this massive historical oversight. By insisting that their experiences were worthy of artistic exploration, that their perspectives were valuable contributions to human understanding, that their voices deserved to be heard. These artists didn't just change the art world, they began to fulfill art's true potential as a universal human language. But the work is far from complete. Each new generation discovers experiences that haven't been fully explored, communities whose stories haven't been told, perspectives that haven't been represented. The revolution that began in the 1960s continues to unfold as humanity continues to discover the full range of its own creative possibilities. Contemporary artists working with disability perspectives are creating work that challenges assumptions about bodies, minds, and human capability. Artists exploring economic inequality are developing new ways to address class consciousness through visual culture. Artists investigating climate change are creating work that connects environmental crisis to social justice. Indigenous artists around the world are reclaiming their cultural traditions while contributing to contemporary artistic conversations. Their work demonstrates how identity-based art can simultaneously honor ancestral knowledge and address present-day concerns. Artists working at multiple intersections continue to reveal the complexity of contemporary identity. They show us that the categories we use to understand ourselves and others are constantly shifting, that identity itself might be best understood as an ongoing creative process rather than a fixed characteristic. The digital revolution has created new possibilities for artistic expression while also raising new questions about identity, community, and authenticity. Artists working with artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and social media are exploring how technology shapes who we are and how we relate to others. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the age of identity is this transformation in how we understand the purpose of art itself. These artists proved that art's highest calling isn't to transcend human experience, but to explore its full depth and complexity. They showed us that beauty isn't separate from politics, but often emerges from honest engagement with social reality. They demonstrated that personal truth isn't the opposite of universal relevance, but often the most direct path to it. Most importantly, they expanded our understanding of human possibility by refusing to accept exclusion as natural or inevitable, by insisting on their right to speak and be heard, by creating work that forced others to see the world through different eyes. They didn't just change art, they changed humanity's understanding of itself. And so we reach the end of tonight's journey through the age of identity. But like all true revolutions, this one has no final destination. It continues to unfold with each artist who refuses to accept limitations, with each viewer who opens their mind to new perspectives, with each institution that chooses inclusion over exclusion. The artists we've encountered tonight, from Alice Neel painting portraits in Spanish Harlem, to contemporary artists exploring digital identities, they're all part of a single, ongoing conversation about what it means to be human, what experiences deserve artistic attention, and how creative expression can serve both individual fulfillment and collective understanding. Their collective achievement is staggering. They transformed art from a narrow conversation between privileged elites into a broad dialogue that includes voices from every community. They proved that excellence emerges from diversity rather than uniformity. They demonstrated that political engagement enhances rather than diminishes aesthetic power. But their greatest achievement might be this. They showed us that art's true purpose isn't to decorate the walls of the powerful, but to expand human empathy, understanding, and possibility. They proved that when we include more voices in cultural conversations, we don't dilute quality. We discover truths that were invisible to more limited perspectives. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, carry with you the courage of these artists. Remember Alice Neel's persistence through decades of neglect. Remember Faith Ringgold's willingness to confront institutional power. Remember Felix Gonzalez Torres' transformation of personal grief into universal beauty. Remember that every time someone creates art from their authentic experience, every time someone refuses to accept cultural limitations as natural, every time someone uses creativity to expand rather than restrict human possibility, they continue the revolution that we've witnessed tonight. The age of identity isn't just a historical period we've studied. It's an ongoing invitation to participate in the expansion of human creative possibility. Whether you're an artist yourself or someone who experiences art, You're part of this continuing transformation. The canvas of human expression is endless, and it belongs to all of us. The artists we've met tonight proved that there's room for every story, every perspective, every voice that approaches art with honesty and courage. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow brings new possibilities for creative expression, new voices to be heard, new truths to be discovered through art. The revolution continues, and you're part of it until we meet again in our next exploration of art's endless possibilities. Remember that every human experience is worthy of artistic attention, that every authentic voice contributes to our collective understanding, and that the future of art belongs to those brave enough to tell their own truth. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. The age of identity continues to unfold, and its story is still being written, but our journey through art history is far from over. Tonight we've seen how artists claimed the right to tell their own stories, to explore their own identities, to demand recognition for their authentic experiences. We've witnessed the transformation of art from an exclusive conversation to an inclusive dialogue. In our next episode, we'll discover how this expanded understanding of artistic possibility encounters the digital revolution. We'll explore how artists are using new technologies, not just as tools, but as entirely new languages for creative expression. We'll witness the birth of virtual galleries, digital sculptures, and artificial intelligence collaborations that challenge everything we thought we knew about creativity itself, from identity to technology, from personal truth to digital possibility. The story continues to unfold. Join me next time as we explore new media, new mind, digital and conceptual art, where we'll discover how artists are reimagining creativity itself. In the age of computers, networks, and artificial intelligence, the revolution we've witnessed tonight set the stage for transformations we're only beginning to understand. The future of art is being written right now, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Remember to subscribe to our channel for more journeys through art history's most fascinating chapters. Like this video if you've discovered something new about the courage it takes to create authentic art, and share it with someone who needs to know that their story, their perspective, their voice matters in the great conversation of human creativity. Until next time, keep creating, keep exploring, and keep believing in art's power to transform not just individuals, but entire worlds. The next chapter awaits, and it's going to be extraordinary. This was Art History, piece by piece. Sleep well.